Okay, welcome everybody to the New York, New Jersey Trail Conference webinar. I'm Rich Rockwell. Tori is our moderator. She's going to keep everybody on mute for the whole time. I'm going to talk for about a little less than an hour. We're going to have time for questions and answers later. I'd like to ask you to hold off on questions and hold them until later, and Tori will moderate that. Under the participant button, you can raise your hand, and this is at the end of the presentation. You can raise your hand and Tori will unmute you and you can ask a question. So do you have anything to say before we get started, Tori? Anything else? Okay.
Nope, that's it. If you have a question that I didn't see your hand raised or anything, you can also, I'll be moderating, I'll be looking at the group chat. So feel free to go in the group chat as well. Okay, and if we build up some questions, we could ask those questions. I'll answer those questions at the end of the session too. So I volunteer with the Trail Conference. I've been doing invasive species surveys, and I've been helping with the invasive website that's part of the Lower Hudson PRISM website. I love to hike, but when I hike, I don't like to just walk. I like to explore things. I like to see you know, abandoned artifacts, railroads, quarries, mines, canals, bridges. If I were to walk on a hike with another hiker, I'd probably take 3 or 4 times because I'd be going, oh, there's a wildflower over there. Oh, there's some invasives over there. And I'd be taking pictures and doing a lot of exploration. So I love the Trail Conference. I'm so grateful for all the work they do. And so appreciative of all the work that all the volunteers do. I'm really honored to be part of this online presentation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the Morse Canal, the Greenway Initiative, Morse Canal Greenway Initiative, links between the Morse Canal and Trail Conference trails, and related industrial archaeological sites and artifacts. So there is an organization called the Canal Society of New Jersey, and they incorporate 2 canals. There were 2 main canals in New Jersey, the Morris Canal in the northern part of the state, the neck of the state, and the Delaware and Raritan Canal at the waist of the state. The Morris Canal went through, as you can see, the highlands, and that's where a lot of our trails are. It went from between Jersey City and Phillipsburg, from Jersey City through Newark, Belleville, Bloomfield, up into Patterson to Little Falls, Wayne, Boonton, Dover, Hackettstown, over to Phillipsburg. And the Delaware and Raritan Canal was a very different canal. It was built a little bit later. It's wider and it's more level down there. So they were able to build that canal with just a series of locks. And these are some photographs of the Delaware and Raritan Canal. There are biking and hiking trails along many miles of it in the Princeton area. This is actually near Kingston, Rocky Hill. It's really a beautiful place, really a great state parkland, and a great place to hike and enjoy some scenery. This is what a typical canal boat looked like on the Morris Canal. They were pulled by a team of mules. So you see the mules over here on the left. They're walking on what we call the tow path. So we talk about tow paths that are now the trail part of the canal. The driver was usually a child who led the mules. And the whole length of the canal across the state was about 100 miles. And it took 5 days to get from one end of the state, one side of the state to the other, with mules and a child walking, pulling, leading the mules. So here's another slide of the Morris Canal. This slide and many of these really nice, colorful slides were created by Joe McKasick, who's a graphic artist and happens to be the president of the Canal Society. And one of the reasons I'm mentioning that is he leads hikes that I'm going to tell you more about later. But he does a great job on these graphics. So not only did the canal go through the highlands in this part of North Jersey, but when they first built the canal,
they thought they would get all the water from the canal from Lake Hopatcong. Lake Hopatcong is the highest point on the canal. And they dammed the lake and increased it to 5 feet. And they thought that would be enough water to supply both the canal in both directions, but it turned out it wasn't enough water. So at some point they started building feeder. They built a feeder from the Pompton Lakes. So all these watershed, the Wanacue, the Peckinac, the Rockaway watershed, Ramapo, these are all where we have a lot of trails now. These are all part of the watershed that was feeding water into the Morris Canal. Now, one of the main reasons the canal was built, there was a lot of coal in these coal fields in the eastern part of Pennsylvania. There was no really practical way to get the coal to the people who needed it. So they started building canals from the coal fields down to the Delaware River. There was one, the Lehigh Canal, connected some coal fields to the Delaware River in Easton. And then the boats could go across Easton and then get on the Morris Canal and bring coal throughout the northern part of New Jersey, but also over to Newark, Jersey City, and New York City. This coal was very important to this region when there are a lot of, in addition to the whole area in North Jersey was very rich in iron ore. There was a lot of iron ore mining and iron industry in the northern part of the state. And a lot of these in the early 1800s, some of these iron forges were having to close because they ran out of fuel. They used charcoal as their source of fuel, and it took thousands of acres of trees to get enough charcoal to run these iron forges. And they basically had stripped the whole northern part of the state of trees to fuel these iron fuel forges. So when coal became available, it revived the iron ore industry. And it was Morris Canal was a very important part of getting that the coal to the iron forges, and also getting the iron products out of the once they were manufactured, to actually ship them. So this graph shows the snapshot of time. More than half of the freight that was carried on the canal was coal. But there were other things that were carried on it too. Most of the coal was all going from Pennsylvania, from the west over to the east. Not only to Newark, Jersey City, New York City, but also various places along the way, like Bloomfield. So there were, when the canal was in operation, there were several coal yards in Bloomfield where the coal would be delivered to these coal yards, and then it would be delivered locally. It was an important source of fuel for heating homes, which hadn't existed previously. And it also stimulated a lot of industrial growth in areas like Bloomfield. So when the canal was first built, the boats only carried about 25 tons. And that wasn't really practical. It just wasn't enough to make it financially viable. So in 1845, they started to rebuild the canal to make it wider and deeper, which also meant they had to rebuild all of the locks and inclined planes. But they were able then, when it was rebuilt, to accommodate boats that would be between 70 and 100 tons. So the really peak time that the canal was really most popular was around the Civil War and shortly after the Civil War. It was never really very profitable. That was the period of time when it was most active. But after 1870 or so, they had actually started building a lot of railroads as feeder lines to these iron industry areas to get coal to the iron forges, get the coal out of the mines, and in the technology of building these railroads, which were feeders to bring materials to and from the canal. With the technology that they were developing with building railroads, they got more advanced at building railroads, and they ended up building railroads all the way across the state, which replaced the canal. Railroads were much more efficient. The canal was really labor intensive. There were locks and planes. They had to have plane tenders, lock tenders. There were 2 people at each plane, 1 person staffing each lock. There were 2 people on each boat. They only ran 6 days a week. They didn't run on Sundays. They couldn't run in the winter. Whereas trains could run 24/7, 365 days a year. They could carry much more freight with much fewer people staffing them. So, things like terracotta, there was a tanning leather industry in Newark. So the leather was shipped out on the canal. They brought in tan bark to the leather industry. Ice, they carried ice on the canal, and a lot of other products. So the Morse Canal was unique in that it had to climb a mountain. They called it the mountain climbing waterway. From Newark to Lake Hopatcong was over 900 feet. Now it wasn't really practical to do that with locks. They would have had to have so many locks, it would take too long and would just take up too much space. So they come up with the idea of using inclined planes. Locks are good for lifting, raising and lower boats about 10 feet, but the inclined planes can handle a difference in elevation of between 50 or 60 and 100 feet. So they came up with the technology to build these inclined planes to bring the boats up and down the mountains. This is what an inclined plane looks like and how it worked. There was a cradle car similar to a railway car with 2 parts on an iron track, much like a railroad track. And this was completely driven by water. So on the upper level, the water from the upper level came through this flume down through this tube into where it spun a turbine, which turned gears, which turned a drum which had a cable on it, which would pull the cradle car up or down the inclined plane. And they would lift or raise or lower the boat 60 to 100 feet. There was so this map shows the iron industry in the North Jersey area where the iron ore fields were, and a lot of railroads and rivers and other means of transportation were used to get the iron ore and the iron products to the canal. But again, these are all areas where we have a lot of trail conference trails. Sorry, I'm having a problem with my slideshow here. Give me a minute. So the inclined planes were an engineering marvel. The inclined plane, there was an inclined plane in Bloomfield. It was inclined plane 11 East. The planes and locks were numbered from Lake Hopatcong going east and west. So this was the 11th plane going east. And it was featured in a Scientific American article in 1882. These illustrations are actually of the inclined plane in Bloomfield. And you can see in this illustration, the boats and the cradle car were hinged in the middle, so the boat and the car could negotiate the summit of the plane. And there were this was a 2-person operation. There was a plane house here where somebody would control the water flow. And there was somebody stationed on the plane, the cradle car itself. So this is a map of Bloomfield. The canal really went from east to west, but the section that went through Bloomfield went north-south. The blue line represents the canal, and the green line represents the Garden State Parkway. And this is one of the things that was typical of the canal after it was abandoned. It was because the land was available, it was used for highways. So the Garden State Parkway buried a large section of the canal where it was in Bloomfield. This is a typical view of what the canal looked like when it was in operation. This is a bridge in Bloomfield, the Berkley Avenue Bridge. You can see the towpath there on the right. This bridge was one of the last remaining bridges over that was built for the Morris Canal, that was still in existence. And it was demolished a few years ago and replaced by a modern bridge. I was involved in influencing the design of the new bridge and made sure that one of the criteria that they had a whole list of criteria that they had to follow in order to get permission to demolish the bridge. They agreed to maintain the trail under the bridge and to make it look like the old bridge. They had to lower it 5 feet for safety reasons, but they also agreed to put these historic interpretive signs there. So there are 2 interpretive signs at the bridge. Now, this is also an example when the canal was abandoned in this section, the canal was filled in and it became a recreational trail. It's part of a park in Bloomfield called Wright's Field. And this is the view from the other side of the bridge. One of the reasons that bridge survived so long was because it spanned not only where the canal used to be, but it also spanned the river, which is to the left, which is Second River. So we needed to keep the bridge in place to get people across the river, and it was still in place up until a few years ago. And this shows how the canal was filled in. This is a section just beyond the bridge, and this was recreational. Has been recreational trail for many years since the canal was abandoned, and it was filled in. There was somebody wanted to turn it into a parking lot in the 1990s, but they were prevented from doing that. Another typical scene where the canal used to be, this is also in Bloomfield at the lock. The lock was 15 East. This is now a parking lot. So many sections where the canal used to be are now parking lots. And this is Liberty Street, the Liberty Street Bridge. This piece of the canal was cut off by the Garden State Parkway. So the historic bridge that you see on the historic photo on the left is in the same location that the bridge is across the parkway over here. And then on the opposite side of Liberty Street, where the canal was, is now a highway called JFK Drive. When the canal was abandoned, this section of canal was abandoned for about 30 years. When the canal was abandoned, the property reverted to the state, and the state offered the property to all the municipalities that it ran through. Newark bought theirs right away because they wanted to build a subway in it, and they did build the subway. They built the city subway in Newark, which is now the Newark Light Rail. They built it right in the bed of the Morris Canal. Bloomfield also was hoping to use their part of the canal as a high-speed trolley line, but that didn't happen. A number of things happened: the Depression, these public transportation grew out of favor, and it ended up just sitting abandoned for 20 or 30, about 30 years. When they built the Garden State Parkway, they used a large section of the canal in Bloomfield for this highway, which was originally called Morris Canal Highway. But when, after JFK's assassination, they renamed it JFK Drive. And it's about a 2-mile section of, the canal through Bloomfield was about 5 miles. The parkway covers about 2 miles. The Garden State Parkway covers a couple miles, and there's another mile or so that's recreational trail. This is another section of JFK Drive where the canal used to be. And looking at the bridge in the distance, that was the Montclair Greenwood Lake Railroad that went up to Greenwood Lake. And this is the trail line that rail line been abandoned for 15 years or so. When they built the new connection in Montclair to the Boonton line, this part of the train line became abandoned, and we're hoping to turn it into a trail, and it will make connections to the Morris Canal Greenway and also possibly other the Lenape Trail and some other trails. So this is what the inclined plane actually looked like in Bloomfield, the historic photo on the left. So when JFK Drive was built, it was built right on the same, right where the incline plane used to be, the same grade. So when you're driving on JFK Drive and you go up this hill, you're going up the incline plane. The house on the left in the historic photo we call the Cohens House. There were two generations of Collinses who were carpenters who worked on the Morris Canal. And we have recently been working at restoring the house. The house was abandoned for 10 or 15 years. And we recently were able to restore the exterior, get a new roof, and stabilize the house. And we're still trying to get funding to finish the interior, where we want to have a caretaker living and have museum and conference space. So when they, early 1900s, they knew the canal wasn't going to be around forever, that something was going to happen to it, but they weren't sure what to do with it, what they were going to do with it. And there were some proposals to turn it into a state parkway, parkway meaning not parkland. So there was an organization that was started that happened to be in Montclair, where they were proposing turning the canal into this parkway. They formed an organization. This is a photograph from the brochure promoting boating and hiking. The wooden structure you see in the distance was an aqueduct that carried the canal over the Passaic River in Little Falls. And biking and horseback riding. And around the same time in 1912, Tori, somebody needs to be muted. I don't know if you can do that. But around 1912, a committee was formed to try to investigate, that got it, thanks, investigate options for what to do with the canal. And they engaged an architectural firm called Carrere and Hastings, who came up with a series of renderings like this, saying, here's a proposal. This is what you could do with this. You could really turn this into some nice parkland. This is a section where you've got highways and parking. They actually took sections of the canal. The photograph on the right is the top of the inclined plane in Bloomfield. And the rendering on the left is a proposal for how that could look if it were a parkway. And another example on the outskirts of a village. But that didn't happen. It would have been very expensive to create this kind of project, but it also would have been very expensive to keep the water in the canal. They had to work to get the water into it. When I pointed out, they had built this feeder to bring water from the Pompton Lakes. It took a lot of work to keep the water in the canal, to maintain the locks and planes. There were 20-some locks, 20-some planes and 30-some locks. They all would have had to be maintained if this were to happen, or they would have had to been converted into.
So,
another factor was that there were issues about who had rights to the water. So most of that water that was coming from the watershed around the Wanacue Reservoir and that part of the state, that's mostly drinking water now. So there could have been conflicts about, we're going to use this water for drinking water, or are we going to use it for parks? But so in most cases, the canal was abandoned. In some cases, there were sections of it that were maintained. I'll show you a couple of those where you can actually go and look at the canal now. It still has water in it. And in 1974, it was added to the State and National Register of Historic Sites. So there were, over the years, there were little sections of canal that were, some of them still had water in it, some of them were recreational trails, like the section in Bloomfield. And there were little parks, and there was a park and a section of canal in Little Falls. Passaic County had put a lot of work into making trails on abandoned parts of the canal. There were some in Warren County, some in Jersey City, Wharton, Clifton, Waterloo Village. There were local historical societies that were involved, but there were all these disparate parts that were all over the state, scattered. So they started thinking about, maybe we could all join together and try to resurrect this idea of a parkway across the state. And 10 or 15 years ago, it started to gather some momentum. In 2012, the NJTPA, the North Jersey Transportation Planning Authority, got people together, created a working group, which included about 150 organizations across the state that were involved in the canal, state, county, and municipal organizations, local historical societies, to try to think about this concept of what could we do to improve the connections between all of these little sections of canals to make a statewide greenway. And in 2018, they commissioned a study called the Corridor Study, which came up with a number of proposals for actually trying to accomplish this. Now, we're never really going to get a straight, continuous trail greenway all the way across the state because of all these places where there are highways in the middle, there are highways that are on top of it, some of it's converted into roadways, some of it's private property. But we're trying to do as much as we can with what we have. So in Bloomfield, for example, we've got, we're marking out trails that you can walk. So along JFK Drive, for example, you can walk on a sidewalk. You're not really seeing the canal, but you're walking where the canal used to be. And we have walking trails that can connect sections of the canal, where the canal doesn't exist anymore. And we also have a mobile app. So you can get this on your iPhone or your Android. If you search for something like Morris Canal Bloomfield or Bloomfield Morris Canal, the screenshot on the right is what the app looks like from the App Store. You can download this app. And it has the photo on the left. The red line is the trail where you can walk. The double green line is the Morris Canal, where the Morris Canal actually used to be. And we have these little pinpoints on the map that show where there are landmarks, and you can click on one of those and see a photograph. So this example right here, this is, the blue line is Second River, and this is where there was an aqueduct that carried the canal across the Second River. So in areas like Bloomfield, you often find the canal was parallel to rivers because it just happened to be the lowest, most level area. But it never interacted with the river. And so the river was lower than the canal, and they actually would build these bridges called aqueducts that carried the canal over the river. There were two of these in Bloomfield, and this is an example of one of them. So this is all in our app. And the other thing you can do, when we got the GIS coordinates for the Morris Canal for this app, we mapped it throughout the whole state. So you can download this app and look at it anywhere in the state to find out where the canal was. So this section on the left shows the canal as it goes through Belleville, and the section on the right shows the north of Bloomfield, where the canal goes up through Clifton and around Garrett Mountain. So you can also trace the canal in the western part of the state too, using the app. We also made a series of wayfinding signs. Joe McKasick, who I mentioned before, did the graphic works on these signs. So we have a sign that you can see easily when you're driving past, and then we have a map that shows the canal throughout the whole town with a little inset showing the area that you're in right now, with details of any of the landmarks that were in the area and alternate walking trails. So this section right here, when you come down where the canal was, this section right here is a parking lot, and it's fenced in and you can't walk there. So we have alternate walking trails along the streets to bypass that area to get you to continue on the greenway. We also have a couple landmark areas on the way. So this is the intersection of Liberty Street and JFK Drive. Scouts have been an important part of maintaining the history of the Morris Canal. In 1960, the picture over here in the distance, the historic photograph, was the Boy Scouts in 1960 placing this monument in this location. And then last year, we had another scout an Eagle Scout do a project where he re-landscaped and cleaned up this area. We got a kiosk sign here that Joe McKasick did. And the gentleman right here was one of the Boy Scouts in this photograph from 1960 who came back to the rededication ceremony of this location. So in the northern part of Bloomfield, this is the part, again, the green line is the Garden State Parkway, the blue is the canal. This map is turned sideways, so north is to the left, to the right. There's a little place, there's a place where the canal made a curve, but the parkway sort of went straight. And there's another area right up here where the parkway bypassed the canal. So there are two little sections of canal that still exist in Bloomfield. And we're kind of taking advantage of that in our greenway. So when you get to the northern part of Bloomfield, that section of canal that exists is behind the state police headquarters on JFK Drive. But when you get past there, there's a golf course. So the canal, this is another impediment to making a continuous greenway. There's still a piece of the Morris Canal that exists on this golf course as a water feature. This is the Upper Montclair golf course, but we can't allow people to walk through here. So as part of our greenway, we have to find alternative trails around it. Now, that other little section that had the little curve, this is what it looked like about 8 years ago. It was completely overgrown and people were dumping stuff there. There were appliances and trash. And Scouts, an Eagle Scout did a project where they got people out the Scouts out to clean up. They cleaned up all the trash, cleaned up the brush. This is what it looks like now, and we converted it. It's now a park. It's now one of the town parks. It's a great place where you can stroll through. When you're walking through here, you're walking right in the bottom, you know, of where the canal used to be. We call it Morris Canal Park, and we made a kiosk explaining a little bit about the canal and the greenway. This is part of the greenway. Now we're also expanding that area of the greenway. This picture you see right here is the Pilch Street Bridge, which crosses the Garden State Parkway, and this is significant because it's the Lenape Trail. So in this section of the greenway, we're crossing the Lenape Trail. A new section of this was recently added by another Eagle Scout project. Let me show you where this is on the map. So the red line here is the Lenape Trail. This is the Trail Conference Lenape Trail, the new Lenape Trail map. Here's the Pilch Street Bridge that I just mentioned. And this is Oak Tree Lane that I just showed you the pictures of. And then this is the new section. There's a school here, Demarest School. And we had to get permission for the easement on the property, and we had to put up a fence here. But there's a section of greenway here that when they built the parkway, there was a little bit of leftover property. They were sort of accounting for some streets that had been removed by the parkway. So there was some land here set aside for streets which hadn't been used. The town owns it, and we're using it as part of the parkway now. So now you can walk all the way from Oak Tree Lane, from Watchung Avenue down through Oak Tree Lane and along this path. And we're hoping to relocate the Lenape Trail so it goes this way. So you'll be walking through the woods and overlapping the Morris Canal Greenway on your way on the Lenape Trail. It then goes over to Clark's Pond and then up to Brookdale Park. So this is one of the, I'm going to be using some of the Avenza, the Trail Conference maps. This is map 125, Jersey Highlands East. And you can see on this map, they do have the Morris Canal on it. So there's a dotted line all along here showing the path of the Morris Canal. So in this area, there are no trails, there are no Trail Conference trails that link to it. But when you see this little section of red, like this area in Boonton, this is Boonton, that means there is a trail on the canal. So there are a number of places where you can have a really nice short scenic walk along a section of canal if you want a short walk. And they're not too far from many of the trail conference trails. This is that section of canal in Boonton. There's a Facebook page for the Morris Canal. Somebody just posted this a couple days ago. I borrowed these photographs to show you a section of a nice scenic route, nice little scenic walk on the canal that's not far from some of the trail conference trails. And another really nice scenic walk is a section of canal in Wharton. They have a canal day once a year where they have activities, music, and food, and boat rides. They have boat rides in this section of canal. And there's a lock in Wharton. This lock that you see on the photograph on the left, they also have boat rides through the canal. The lock was completely filled in when the canal was abandoned. It was just filled with dirt and rocks. And they've removed all that, and the stonework from the original lock was still intact. They restored it, and they're actually working. It's mostly restored now, but they're actually working at making it into a working lock. So as part of the boat ride, you'll be able to take the boat into the lock, rise up into the lock the 10 feet that it would have if you were in a canal boat, and come out at the top on the remaining part of the canal. Another great place to explore the canal is Waterloo Village. There's also a small section of canal, and they have canal days there several times in the summer where they have boat rides and other activities. This is a store that was on the canal. The other side of this store is part of the village. And the rear of the store is where they loaded materials that were brought in from the canal. There are a number of old houses that were there from when this was a village, when the canal was active. This was a state park for, well, it's been a state park for many years, but it's gone up and down in terms of how it was maintained. It was maintained fairly regularly. These houses were maintained years ago, but then they were not maintained for a number of years, and we're getting back into, they recently got some funding to restore some of the houses. But it's a beautiful place to go and walk. There's also a canal museum, the Canal Society. One of the old buildings that's part of the village is now the Canal Society Museum. Now, one of the interesting parts of this trip, the Waterloo Village, this is the Alamucci Mountain map, the Avenza, it's a free Avenza map that has trail conference trails on it. This is the Sussex branch trailhead right here where the arrow is. The Sussex branch goes off to the north here on a trail. And this is the highway down here is Route 80, and the highway over here on the right is 206. So when you're at this exit on Route 80, you'll see signs that direct you to Waterloo Village. And we use this logo to represent the Morris Canal Greenway. That's actually a trailblaze that we use on the Greenway trails. And you'll see there's a little section here of the Greenway and a little section over here, but you'll notice there's no way to get to this. But there is some very interesting stuff to see if you do make a connection here. And I'm going to use the map on the left is the All Trails map, same location. So on this map, you can park here at the trailhead for the Sussex branch, and walk down Continental Drive, and you'll see a trail in the woods. You can walk onto this trail. This part on the south area is the one that you saw on the other map that's shown, that's actually where the canal was. But there's another interesting trail up here that's an abandoned railroad. So you'll end up on the opposite side of the river from Waterloo Village. But one of the interesting things to see here is there was this is an ice house when you're probably only going to see this in the times when there are no leaves on the trees. When you see it from a distance, it looks like a log cabin, but these are actually terracotta, pieces of terracotta that are actually hollow inside. And that's what's forming the walls, and it's still intact. So this was an ice house. They harvested ice from that lake that was across from Waterloo Village, stored it in the ice house, and this was one of the other things that was shipped on the Morse Canal. If you go a little further, you'll come to this. This is the remnants of one of the incline planes. This was plane 4 west. We're now at the 4th plane west of Lake Hopatcong, going towards Easton and Phillipsburg. So it's really some really beautiful stonework. This has been here for, this stone wall would have been built when the canal was widened between 1845, 1860. So this has been here for over 150 years, this stonework. And this is an abutment. When I was talking about walking on the trail, there was an abandoned train line. If you were to continue on that, this train line actually crossed the canal. So it would have been, here's the other abutment on the other side. The train line went right across here. And all the way at the bottom of the plain is the river, and then Waterloo Village is on the other side of that river. And that's, if you go to the bottom of the plain, that's the view of Waterloo Village from across the river. And there used to be a bridge that you can see on the left. That was a photograph from a few years ago. The bridge was, I'm not even sure how much of it is left there, but most of it's collapsed. But they are planning to rebuild that bridge and to be able to have, so that you can go to Waterloo Village, walk across the bridge and walk on the trail and see the remnants of this inclined plane. There's also some very interesting artifacts all the way at the top of the plane, all the way up here. They used cables to pull these cradle cars and the boats up and down the inclined planes. The cables were 2 inches thick. They were very similar to cable made by Roebling. That was the twisted cable that was used in bridges like the Brooklyn Bridge. And there are pieces of that cable that you can find at the top of this. And you can continue on a trail, and once you get to the top of this inclined plane, you'll see where the canal used to be, and you can walk along the towpath, continuing the trail, and it makes a loop back to where you started from. So another little interesting, so there's, talking about all this iron industry, this is another interesting place. This is map 125 at Wildcat Ridge. I started doing invasive species surveys, and this was my first assignment, but this is what the trailhead looks like at Hibernia, Wildcat Ridge. Joe McKasick leads these industrial heritage tours where he actually takes you on tours of places like this, shows you where the mines used to be, abandoned railroads. We walked around the village of Hibernia. You can see entrances to mines where quarries used to be. And these are sponsored by the Morris County Park Commission, and Joe's been doing this for 22 years. I'll show his email address again at the end of the presentation. You can email him if you want to get on his mailing list. He does, I don't know, 6 or 8 of these in a typical summer, not this year, but spring, summer, even in winter. He does these tours of industrial archaeological sites around North Jersey, many of them overlapping trail conference trails. These are some of the things he does that were scheduled for March and April. Most of these are canceled this year, but Orland of the Greenway from Denville to Rockaway, Split Rock Furnace, those are all on the map 125, the trail conference map. And Mount Hope is on map 126. So you'll see a lot of these landmarks on the trail conference maps. So anyway, this is, I started my invasive species survey at this location. This is the trailhead at Wildcat Ridge in Hibernia, going on the Four Birds Trail. And when I came to this spot and started looking around, I said, wow, I really hit the jackpot. There's every invasive, almost every invasive on my list right here in the first 100 or 200 feet. There are all of these invasives, and it's infested with these invasives. Over here, you can see this winding around these trees. This is Oriental bittersweet, one of these vines that actually chokes the trees. And you typically see a lot of invasives at trailheads, but this has, because this was all a mining area, so this was all cleared at one point 100 years or so ago, and it was all completely bare. So the things that came in and grew in here were more likely to be invasives. Another reason you see a lot of them here. And this is one of the old, some artifact from some of the mining operation that was in the area. And if you walk down the Four Birds Trail, the white trail, this thing I'm showing on the picture isn't right on the trail, but if you're walking on the trail, as I did in the summer when it was above 90 degrees, there's a little section of the trail, also depending on the weather conditions, you may see this foggy mist coming down a little valley, and you'll feel this cool breeze coming down the valley. If you follow that breeze, you'll come up to this abandoned mine entrance. And on a day when it's 90 degrees outside, you'll feel a 60-degree breeze blowing out of this, this abandoned mine. Going the other direction, there's a Beach Glen Trail that goes the other direction from the parking lot. Another thing to look for when you're walking on trails, when you see a really level section, that's probably either an abandoned road or a railroad. This section here, when you look carefully, there's a railroad tie here, a railroad tie here. So this is one of those abandoned railroads that was part of the mining operation. Another thing that happens with railroads, typically low-lying areas, so they're often the first to flood. The trail actually used to go to this section of the abandoned railroad, but it's flooded so much that they redirected the trail up a hill. Another thing to look for when you see sort of unnatural looking landscape, these little hills that you're seeing, this is all part of the same hilly thing. If you really look carefully, you'll see this isn't really a hill, it's a pile of stone. This is a huge pile of stone that was part of the mining operation. That was just the detritus from the mining operations that they piled up. And you'll see a number of these in the area, in this area on the Wildcat Ridge trails. And on the right is where the trail was relocated from the railroad up to this hilly part. And for those of you who haven't been able to get out, this is the time of year when spring beauties are in bloom. The wildflowers are all starting to bloom. Wanted to give you a little picture of that. This is from about a week ago, since you can't get out and go to these places. Speaking of industry, there were some industrious beavers at work here. The whole top of this tree was chewed off, and they took down these two trees. I've never seen a live beaver in the wild. I hope I get a chance to see one. I'd love to see one of these days, but I haven't yet. Going down the Beach Glen Trail, there's some more mining artifacts. These are a little bit more recent than the ones that we saw near Hibernia, which were older stone buildings. These are a little bit more modern masonry buildings, and this wooden structure that's all collapsed and vandalized. This is on the Beach Glen Trail. And then there are also some very interesting iron furnaces around on some of the trail conference trails. The one on the left is Wildcat Ridge near the Split Rock Reservoir, and the one on the right is in Sterling Forest. This was rebuilt in the 1960s. So there are a lot of these interesting kind of artifacts to see. And that wraps up my talk. I'm available if anybody has any questions. These are some of the resources. The Canal Society of New Jersey has a great website with a lot of information. If you want to get information about the industrial heritage tours, you can email Joe McKasick. He's also involved with the Society for Industrial Archaeology, the Roebling chapter. And then Morris Canal Greenway, if you do a Google search, there are a couple websites. The NJTPA site has a lot of useful information and has the results of that study they did of creating the Greenway, that has a whole list of prioritized projects that are potential for connecting all the disparate sections of canal into a statewide Greenway. And there are Facebook pages. There's a Morris Canal Greenway Facebook page. We have a Morris Canal in Bloomfield Facebook page. I lead hikes on the Morris Canal in Bloomfield a couple times a year. We had to cancel our spring hike this year, but we'll be doing another one in the fall. So that's it. And I'll be glad to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Rich, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. The inclined planes, and they had that plane house at the top.
Mm-hmm.
Did they have a lot of problems keeping that running? Like, did it break down a lot? Did they have accidents?
Well, gee, good question. As a matter of fact, the ones that you see in photographs and the ones that I showed in pictures are the second generation of inclined plane. Those were the ones when they rebuilt the canal and made it wider. They had to rebuild all the planes, and they standardized on this type that had this thing called a Scots Turbine, which was an iron turbine, and it was more efficient. And they redid all the planes using that technology. Before that, they were all different. They weren't really sure what the right technology was. They held a contest to see who could come up with the idea for the best inclined plane. And as a matter of fact, a Bloomfield resident named Ephraim Morris won the contest for building a plane in Bloomfield. And most of them used those kind of water wheels that you think of, a traditional water wheel, an overshot water wheel. And they all use slightly different technology, but when they rebuilt the canal, they standardized on that technology. Initially, they tried using chains as the means to pull the boats up and the boats on the cradle cars up and down. Those broke occasionally. There is a story where there was a woman and her kids were on the boat. Sometimes families would live on these boats. They had a really small little living area. You can imagine how small it would be. There was a woman who was on the boat. The chain broke. The boat goes sliding, rushing down the inclined plane. Luckily, nobody was injured, but she came off and said, "Oh, gee, I thought that's the way it was supposed to work." So the chains didn't work very well. They tried using hemp rope. The hemp rope didn't work very well. And then this Roebling cable technology was in use, and that became the most practical way to do it. They used tar to lubricate them. But pretty much once they improved that technology, there's also, Ephraim Morris also invented a braking system so that if this cable, the cradle car did, lose the cable, it would stop. So once they standardized on that technology, they didn't have many and used the cables. They didn't have many. I'm not aware of accidents happening once they improved the technology. It did use a lot of water. That was one of the issues. These locks and planes used a lot of water, and that's one of the reasons they were not able to get enough water from Lake Apatcong.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have one more question if nobody else has one. What are invasives?
Invasives are plants that aren't native to the area. So and they tend to be very aggressive, and they take over the area. They crowd out native species. The native species also support the animals, birds, and other things that live in the area. When invasives come in, they take over the native species, and they crowd out all the natives and don't allow for the biodiversity that we need in the world. And most of them, a lot of them have been introduced through landscaping. Some of them were introduced by accident. You'll see a lot of something called barberry, which is a thorny thing, which was a popular landscaping shrub, which it just goes crazy in some places in the woods. It'll take over. You'll see vines like I showed you in the picture, the Oriental bittersweet, which will climb up trees and kill them. It'll suffocate them and grow up the trees. And they also tend to crowd out the sunlight from getting to the ground. So they don't allow native wildflowers and other native plants to survive because they don't get any sunlight because the invasives have crowded out. So there are initiatives. There's a group within the Trail Conference that's connected to the Lower Hudson PRISM, which is the Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management, that have volunteer projects to teach people about invasives, to teach them to do surveys, to survey where invasives are along the Trail Conference trails, and then do projects to mitigate the impact of some of these invasives, removing them. So there's a lot of information about that on the Trail Conference website.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Rich, this is Mario. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, the Scots Turbine that you spoke of, there's one located on display. It's massive at Lake Hopatcong.
Yes, thanks for pointing that out. There is one there, yes.
I have a picture of it. If you'd like, I can email it to you.
I have pictures of them too.
Oh, do you? Okay.
It would take me a minute to find it, so I don't want to look for it right now.
No.
But yeah, I do have a picture of it. Yeah, it's a great. There's some parks and some kiosks and information about the canal and the turbines and stuff at Lake Hopatcong. There's also the descendant of James Lee, who wrote the book on the Morris Canal. His grandson lives in one of the plains and sometimes gives tours. One of these, the chamber where that water went through and the Scotch turbine was, there is one of those intact that his grandfather actually, this was one of those things that was all filled in with stones and dirt and all kinds of trash was just dumped into this inclined plane, the chamber, and he restored it, took all the stuff out, and you can actually walk into it and look at it. Really beautiful stonework. These things were incredible, the amount of work and craftsmanship that went into some of these things.
Hey, Rich, I have a question from, I think it's E. Muller. So first, he wants to know actually where that Scotch turbine is actually located.
Lake Hopatcong, but Mario, can you describe more specifically where it is at Lake Hopatcong?
Yes, I've only been there once, and I parked my car in the parking lot. There's like a booth where you have to pay to go in, although there was no one at the booth. I think it was like after Labor Day. And I parked my car and I walked across the entire parking lot. To the right was, I think, the restrooms or something. My memory is foggy on that. But if you walk diagonally through the parking lot to the water on a grassy area is the it's housed in a cement enclosure, and you'll be surprised at the size of it. It's just the opening is 5 feet in diameter, so yeah, it's gigantic. You can't miss it. I mean, it's gigantic. So that's the best. It's near the dam where the water is, and it's the best I can explain on how I got to it.
He also wants to know if there's any more remaining inclined plane mechanisms.
Well, yeah, I can't remember off the top of my head which one where the one is that the Lees live.
9W.
9W, 9 West. And what's the town?
It's near Stewartsville.
He's got there's a small museum there. You can probably, there's probably information about it on the Canal Society website, and or you can get it from the Canal Museum. But there's probably information about it on the Canal website. They do have tours there periodically, and There's a little museum. There's a house that used to be there, that was there since the time of the canal. It's turned into a museum. And occasionally they have tours of the plane. And you can see the grade of, there's several places where you can walk the grade. The grade of where the plane was is still there. Like the one that I showed you near Waterloo Village. There are several of those where there is park area, but you can't really see much of the mechanism still isn't in place. But you can see the grade where the plane was.
Okay, and then Stan has a question.
Rich, are there parts of the canal that are suitable for kayaking, or that actually allow kayaking on the water?
Good question.
Well, your best place for kayaking would be go to the Delaware and Raritan Canal in the southern part of the state, down near Princeton or Kingston.
Yeah, I've done that.
The ones in the Morris Canal, there are sections like that section in Wharton, but they're really small. They're not like very long. So you could kayak in them for a little bit, but you really wouldn't get very far.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Looked inviting.
Yeah, especially the one in the Delaware and Raritan is really a great place for that kind of thing.
Yeah, I did that many years ago with my son. It was wonderful.
Does anybody have more questions?
I'm really glad to see so many people interested in the topic. Thank you all for joining. Glad to be.
Fascinating. Thank you.
So a lot of good feedback in the chat, Rich.
Good.
We're really appreciative. Great. Okay, well, if we don't have any more questions or anybody has any comments, I'm as the Trail Conference staff liaison, I really want to thank you, Rich. This was really interesting. I learned so much. And thank you so much for being our first person to do this. We're obviously experimenting a little bit at the Trail Conference with how to still be engaging for everybody. And this was such a good start. So thank you, and thank everybody for joining us.
Okay, glad to do it. See you all later. Out on the
Secretary.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye, everybody. I'll close it up.